Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you're calling in from. We're so happy that you've joined us from all over the world to talk about contract transparency today. I'm Aubrey Menard. I'm a senior policy advisor for transparency with Oxfam America, and I'm delighted to be hosting such esteemed panelists today. First, I must apologize. I'm recovering from COVID, and I might devolve into a coughing fit at any point. So if you see me go off screen, that's what's happening. Welcome to this session on Wednesday, June 29th of the 2022 PWYP Global Assembly. As people join, I will run you through some of the technical aspects of the platform. This session will take place in English and in French. To hear interpretation in Spanish, French, Arabic, English, or Russian, you can go to the Sessions tab on the right side of your screen in the white area, and then go to the Translations tab just below that. If you're joining from your phone, you will see a small gray arrow in a circle in the bottom right of your screen. Click this button and you will see the option for translation. Remember that you will need to mute all of the speakers in order to hear the interpretation clearly. To access the chat for this specific session, please make sure that you are in the Sessions tab on the right side of your screen and select Chat just below that. Please introduce yourselves in the chat and send a message here if you're having any technical challenges. Please feel free to ask questions in the session Q&A to the speakers while they're presenting. Please don't use the chat for questions to the speakers. Once the presentations are finished, we will be also inviting audience members to ask their questions live if they would like to do so. Please note that live questions can only be translated in English and French. Live questions must be brief. Okay, let's get started. I'd like to start today by setting the stage by giving us a bit of background for what we're talking about in terms of contract transparency, and then I'll move on to asking some questions to our panelists. So typically, when governments decide to extract resources, oil, gas, or minerals, they enter into a contract with a company that has the expertise, equipment, and financing to remove those resources from the ground and bring them to market. These contracts form a key part of the legal infrastructure and offer citizens crucial pieces of information. They can reveal many things. At their most basic level, they can show how much companies should be paying for oil, gas, or minerals, so that through the combination of these and other disclosures, oversight actors are able to investigate whether those payments are being made in full. In addition to financial details, contracts can also contain health, safety, and environmental commitments or social obligations that companies have made when operating in countries or communities. They can even require that the impacts on certain populations, such as women or indigenous people, are researched before exploration or extraction, and can mandate the input or consent of such people. In order for citizens and oversight actors to ensure that companies are meeting the obligations under their contracts, they must obviously have access to these contracts. However, for far too long, that access has been very difficult to come by. In fact, contracts governing extractive industries are often shrouded in opacity. Despite citizens being the real owners of their country's natural resources, they are often unable to see the details of the deals that the government has made on their behalf. This lack of transparency has had negative consequences the world over. Secrecy has allowed corrupt government officials to offer overly generous incentives to companies in exchange for kickbacks, engage in unfair bidding or licensure practices, and compromise their nation's future in various ways. And resource contracts are also locking countries into deals and policies that are preventing governments from adequately addressing climate change. Secrecy has prevented people from having a say over what they want to trade, whether they want to trade the deleterious effects of extraction for potential financial gains. And limited access to information has left little room for people to push for greater benefits from or ownership over their natural resources, as well as companies' access to and stewardship of their communities. As the world moves forward with the energy transition, it's more important than ever that citizens have information about the oil, gas, and mining contracts that governments are signing on their behalf. Publish What You Pay and our civil society allies have long been urging countries and companies to disclose the deal. We've been fighting for contract transparency in the extractive industries for more than a decade, emphasizing the importance of citizens and communities' right to know and right to decide about the natural resource extraction taking place in their backyards. Over time, contract disclosure has increasingly become a global norm, as both international organizations and companies have developed policies on publishing contracts. Last year, the EITI, an international organization that brings together companies, country governments, and civil society to promote transparency in oil, gas, and mining, and the ICMM, the Industry Association for Mining Companies, made key advances in contract transparency, which we'll talk about today. But much more needs to be done. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Rob Pittman. Rob is a senior governance officer at the Natural Resources Governance Institute, and he's a go-to expert on contract transparency. He's who I turn to when I have questions about contract transparency. So we're lucky to have Rob with us today. So Rob, you've been working on contract disclosure in the extractive sector for years now, and this year marks the first year anniversary of the EITI standard on contract transparency. From a global perspective, how do you assess the progress made so far, and what do you think are the remaining challenges?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's always a great pleasure to be talking at these to publish what you pay. So yes, to answer your question, I think I just want to back up a little bit and just say the good news is that we've seen the strong foundations of the norm of contract transparency further reinforced over the past few years. There are now more public contracts than ever. Resource Contracts, the world's largest repository of publicly available oil, gas, and mining contracts, now hosts over 2,800 documents. And every time I talk about this, I have to change that number. Relating to international standards, you mentioned the EITI requirement. Other big advances in the last year is that the new GRI sector standards for oil and gas and for coal covered contract transparency for the first time. The full range of international organizations with policies, statements supporting contract transparency now includes the IMF, the International Bar Association, the OECD, the UN, the IFC, EBRD, and many more. It's a huge list. As this is happening, more and more governments are disclosing. There are now 49 countries that have officially disclosed at least one extractive industry contract, and 32 with policies in place making publication mandatory. And we're really lucky to have Waleed here from Lebanon, who'll be talking about their experience. But I think some of the most notable changes, and you alluded to this, actually come from the private sector. Late last year, the ICMM, the main sort of mining industry body, announced that its 28 members had agreed to a new commitment on contract transparency. This takes the total number of extractive companies with a public statement or policy supporting contract transparency up to at least 42. And just to put that number in context, the last time a comprehensive count was made in 2018 by Oxfam, that number was just 18. So there's now, a huge growth in the number of companies that are engaging on this issue. So that's all the good news. But as you mentioned, and I want to just reinforce, despite this progress, it's really important that we don't get complacent. And looking ahead, I see three main challenges. The first one is very simple. It's just that many important contract documents remain secret. While many countries have officially disclosed some contracts, the number of countries that disclose all of their contracts is much, much lower. If we dig into those 49 countries that I mentioned that officially disclose, only 24 have disclosed comprehensively in one sector, and only 7 have disclosed comprehensively in both sectors. There is some nuance here and some slight silver linings. our latest resource governance index, an index that NRGI produces, that was released in December, showed that countries are doing a much better job of disclosing recent contracts than those sort of deep in history. And this suggests that new rules such as those like the EITI rules are actually having a bit of an effect. And we're also seeing some countries extending good practices from one sector to other sectors where, which may be lagging behind a little bit. So, for example, in Ghana, mining contracts are now being published officially, following the lead of the petroleum sector. But overall, I just want to reinforce that the fact that these, in most countries around the world, that disclosure is still partial means that what we've achieved is not enough yet. More needs to be done. The second sort of big point I want to make is that many countries exhibit what we call an implementation gap on contract transparency. And again, here I'm going to talk about the resource governance index. Our resource governance index shows that most countries scored better on the passing of laws on contract transparency than they did on actual disclosures. And this mismatch between the law and the actual practice, I think, erodes the norm that we're trying to build, and it provides ammunition to critics who want to say that contract transparency is too hard to implement. So as civil society, I think it's critical that we call out countries where they're falling short of their own laws. And the third point, the third big challenge is that the narratives and the risks surrounding resource governance are changing. And as this happens, we need to change the way we talk about contracts to make sure that our arguments for contract transparency stay relevant. One way that this is happening is the energy transition. The energy transition is transforming extractive industries worldwide and means that fossil fuel production is set to decline, and the extraction of critical minerals required for green technologies is set to increase. Contract transparency in the contracts themselves will be essential to understanding how these shifts will impact the benefits and challenges associated with natural assets. Contracts will be a critical input for the kinds of financial analysis needed to understand how asset stranding or shorter project lives is going to affect government benefits. Also, countries need to be looking at how some of the terms they put in their contracts, such as stabilization, arbitration, or force majeure, how those terms might be tying the hands of national policymakers as they're seeking to avoid transition risks. There's a great brief by my colleague, Nicola Woodruff, that explains this in a bit more detail, and I'll share that in the chat. Another way that things are changing is that many countries and companies are looking at new ways to finance extractive deals. And as this happens, we need to be making sure that we're getting the documents we need to effectively understand and scrutinize these deals. A couple of examples: in Ghana and DRC, public debates have taken place around the arrangements under which governments are using future streams of natural resource income to leverage financing. Other important agreements that we need to see are infrastructure agreements. They'll remain as important as ever. And also, from the community level, making sure that community development agreements are public so that communities can see the benefit streams that go directly to them. I'm going to really enjoy the conversation that follows. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Rob, for such a detailed overview of what's going on in contract transparency and the progress that's been made, and also what we have to be looking out for and pushing for going forward. Next, I'd like to welcome Sophie Donselman, who is a Senior Program Officer at the International Chamber of Mining and Metals, the ICMM. Sophie, we've been hearing already this morning, we're only 14 minutes into session, and we've heard from both me and Rob about the ICMM's big announcement last year that your 28 member companies have committed to disclosing all licenses granted or entered into from 1st January 2021. This is such a big deal. If implemented, this commitment has the potential of creating a new wave of disclosure. I'm curious if you can share with us why ICMM decided to take this step, what progress has been made and what are the challenges that you're facing to implement this commitment. You know, we just heard Rob talk about the challenges of an implementation gap with where laws or rules or policies don't necessarily line up with actual practice. And then finally, I want to ask you, notably, the commitment doesn't include most active contracts. It only includes those from 2021 onward. And of course, most existing contracts are from 2021 backward. Do you foresee ICMM including or requiring disclosure of any of those retroactive contracts in the future to really open up the contract data that's available to citizens?
Thanks, Aubrey. And before we get started, I'd probably echo what Rob said before. It's such a pleasure to be here with such esteemed panelists and speaking to Publish What You Pay. And the member commitment, we were extremely proud to announce that last year. And a little bit more about that is that it takes this policy first implemented by the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which we've already discussed, and also that all of our 26 ICMM members are EITI supporting companies. But the commitment that we made really extends this EITI policy to dozens of mineral-rich countries that do not currently implement the EITI. And that's really to say that our members commit to disclose contracts in all countries in which they operate, not just the EITI implementing countries, which we think really helps to further progress and establish practice of contract disclosure as a global norm. Now, why we did this, your question. We did this because we believe that the mining industry has a crucial role to play in supporting good natural resource governance. And central to this is this commitment to transparency and to accountability. They're intrinsically entwined. The benefits, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, but they're really clear, right? Disclosure empowers citizens to monitor whether extractive companies are fulfilling their obligations. It empowers them to hold companies accountable. Everyone benefits when corruption is reduced, when government officials are held accountable to arrange fair contracts with reputable companies drafted in a way that's consistent with their country's legal framework. And then also from the company perspective, contract disclosure makes it easier for companies to show that they comply with their financial and social obligations, and it helps them to address reputational risks. Disclosing the terms of contracts support open, fact-based dialogue that can build trust, reduce conflict, and reinforce a company's social license to operate. So in terms of the progress that's been made, I'd refer back to the statistic that Rob mentioned earlier about the number increasing from just 18 to 42 after our commitment. And we believe that this statistic in and of itself is really emblematic of the progress that the commitment, the ICMM, all 26 members made, what that really represents in the industry. But of course, with progress, there can be challenges, and challenges to successful contract disclosure include, as we know, some of the legal barriers related to disclosure in some jurisdictions, whether there's an explicit confidentiality agreement or contractual provision prohibiting the disclosure of the contract. And in cases like this, company members, ICMM members, will encourage the government, the counterparty, its partners, shareholders, any other third party covered in that confidentiality agreement to provide written consent to company members for the contracts to be disclosed. So there are challenges, but they can be overcome. On the commitment not including active contracts, that's true, but a number of ICMM members are already doing so, and we encourage members to go beyond the requirement for publishing historic contracts. Why we've stopped short of making this a specific member requirement is in our recognition of some of the challenges, the barriers that we've just discussed, and in helping our companies to do so. So in that, we're working with member working groups to promote active knowledge sharing on contract disclosures, to let some of our companies learn from the best practices of other members who are successfully disclosing historic contracts to help companies navigate those barriers. Thanks, Aubrey.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Congratulations again on getting this through with your companies, and we're really looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna kick it over to our next panelist, Walid Nasser, who is the acting chairman of the board of the Lebanese Petroleum Administration. Walid, we're so happy to have you with us today, and we're really excited to learn about what's going on in Lebanon. Can I ask you, what other disclosures in the oil and gas sector are relevant, in your opinion, for the newly formed parliament and upcoming government to work on in order to complement the previous contract disclosure work that's already been done on the Lebanese Petroleum Administration's website?
Thank you, Aubrey. And I would like first to thank the Publish What You Pay for inviting us to be part of this session and present what we have done in terms of contract transparency. It is really appreciated, and a lot of work has been done with Publish What You Pay in Lebanon, and we thank them for that. Basically, before we go into the new parliament, I think for the audience, I need to give a little bit of what happened before. Lebanon is a newcomer to the oil and gas industry. We don't have discoveries or production yet. So the main work for the past years was basically to establish the legal and institutional framework for Lebanon. So we opted to have an up-to-date best practice legal framework, basically holding accountability at the highest level. And this was very critical for Lebanon because of the low trust that the public has towards the government. And, oil and gas is a major sector that has a lot of experiences worldwide that are not so positive. So we wanted to enhance this trust between the public and the government on the oil and gas sector specifically, since it is new and we don't have a history of bad practices. So we did this international benchmarking, including EITI, of course. And we thought that before joining EITI, because it's a long process, so why don't we mainstream all the EITI standards into a national law, into our regulations. And we thought that this is really a very high objective, and it's very hard to achieve because in many countries, or maybe very few countries, actually have contract transparency and the transparency measures embedded in a national law. So we thought, let's give it a try. And we were lucky enough to work with very good members of parliament in the Energy Committee and in other committees in the Lebanese parliament previously. And we took the EITI standard and other best practices in transparency, and we mainstreamed that into a national law called Enhancing Transparency in the Oil and Gas Sector, that was enacted in 2018. Before that, Lebanon has signed 2 exploration and production agreements with a consortium of international companies. So we wanted to set a best practice even before this law was enacted. And the Minister of Energy at the time, with the Petroleum Administration, decided to actually publish those 2 contracts fully, and with all the pages, all the annexes, all the details. So the minister took a minister's decision to actually publish these contracts. Of course, we consulted with the companies before, and to be honest, first, we didn't see any rejection from these companies to publish these contracts. And actually, we published all these contracts on the Lebanese Petroleum website before this law was enacted. And this was a breakthrough in the industry, I think, and in Lebanon specifically, to publish all the details of these contracts, because we have nothing to hide. And all the contract terms are in line with the best practices, and they are fair enough for Lebanon and for the companies. And this was done and published. Then the law came in, and it became now an obligation, a legal obligation for the companies and the government to abide by. In parallel, we, of course, also worked with civil society organizations, with research institutes, and we tried to raise the awareness regarding contract transparency, and we got all the support from these organizations to move forward. And I think that this was also something not very common in countries where the government takes the initiative to join EITI and then to bring civil society together and move forward with contract transparency. And I think this was a very good practice that we were lucky to be able to do. Then now we have an obligation for that. Then we started the exploration activities, and we have the operator. In this case, we have Total Energies as an operator with Novatec and DNI as partners. And we did the first drilling exploration in Lebanon. And one part of the law was also not only to publish the exploration and production agreements, but also to publish who are the subcontractors and the beneficial ownership of these subcontractors. And this was another breakthrough because, maybe at a high level, the contracts between the state and the right holders are more straightforward, but a lot of question marks usually are raised when the operator starts contracting and subcontracting and you have many companies engaged. So again, here we wanted to have high accountability and transparency. So we published actually the list of all the companies that were subcontracted by the operator and the beneficial owners, the real beneficial owners of these companies on the LPA website also. And this was very clear who were these companies and who are the owners of these companies. And it was very clear whether politicians are engaged or politically exposed personnel were engaged or not. And I think this was also another best practice to move on. Lately, related to your question, what is still needed, I think we have a very comprehensive legal framework in work. In terms of laws, I don't think another law is needed. What we have is enough. Of course, it can be always enhanced with experience and with years to come. Lately, like less than a month ago, the cabinet approved a decree which establishes the petroleum register. And this is also a very important milestone because now we have a ministerial decree establishing a petroleum register with all the details where everything needs to be published, registered and published on the LPA website and officially at the administration. This includes all the licenses, the coordinates of the blocks, and later on for the production data, for the cost implicated, for the profit that is going to the government or to the companies. And we will have a portal, hopefully when we have more activities for exploration and production, we will have a portal where all these data will be published and can be accessed by the public or anyone interested. To top this up, the Parliament also has published the Access to Information Law, where the public has the right to ask for any information needed from the government. And this law also has the details of how you can ask for this information and what are the obligations of the different governmental institutions to respond to these requests and provide the information needed. This is briefly what has been done regarding the contract transparency and publication of relevant information. And we are still moving forward on this, and the system will always evolve in parallel with the evolvement of the sector. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Waleed, for that really interesting report from Lebanon. As a civil society activist, listening to what you're saying, it's so exciting to me because so much of the work that we do is trying to get these transparency governance measures in place so that as new countries come online, either with oil and gas or with the energy transition, we see all sorts of new extractors popping up, that they don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. And so that a country like Lebanon that's coming online, 20 years later than maybe, another country had, can learn from other countries' experiences, what we've been able to codify in sort of the EITI standard and other international standards. And you can be in a much better position in terms of what your extractive governance looks like going forward. So inspiring to hear what Lebanon is doing. Thanks for that. I was gonna turn it over now to Abu Bakrin, but I think he's just dropped off the line again. He's calling in from Mali and is having a lot of trouble with his internet connection. So why don't I instead pose a question to all of our panelists now? So what I want to ask the full panel is where you, and we'll just go in the same order that we just went. But the question is, what do you see in the future of contract transparency? And, what would you like to see going forward? Why don't we start with you, Rob, and then we'll go over to Sophie and Walid. And if Abu Bakrin is able to call back in, maybe we'll interrupt answering this question to turn over to him.
Okay, great. So yeah, what do I see sort of coming up next? I mean, I think for me, the main thing is I think we need to reflect in part on what contract documents we need to see. Most of the contract transparency advocacy so far has focused on the main contract document that contains most of the terms associated with exploitation. But in many jurisdictions, additional terms feature in a range of associated social environmental documents. These documents haven't been published at all with the same kinds of frequency as the main contracts, but finally we're beginning to see them getting the attention they deserve. And so I think what I'm talking about is a range of additional agreements. I mentioned some of these before, but some financing agreements, some agreements, maybe infrastructure and barter agreements, social environmental agreements, or agreements that talk about that kind of spending. And as we do this, it might be necessary that we're going to need to engage with people. And when I'm talking about I'm talking about civil society activists. I'm also talking about governments. They're going to be able to have to engage with people that they don't normally engage with in publishing these kinds of things. So local governments who might not be as familiar with many of the arguments that we're making today, for example. So that's one big area that I see as something we need to do. The other thing about the future of contract transparency, I think, is making sure that people are using these documents and understand how to use them. And there's a couple of thoughts here. First is that we are asking the right questions. And I think I'm not so concerned here because contracts are so central to so many issues in resource governance that almost any question that we want to ask about a project, we need to find out the rules that underpin that project. So that in some ways is answered for us. But what I think we do need is sort of legal support and help to look through those. And one area where we're hoping to see some progress here in very concrete terms for Publish What You Pay and for NRGI is we have an upcoming grant from the World Bank to support contract transparency and analysis that we're expecting to come through soon from the EGPS. So I'll leave that there for the moment, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rob, for that answer. Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking about what's going to happen when we get all of these contracts out, and I think one of the other things that it'll do is enhance other data that we're already getting. So, for example, the EITI produces a lot of payments to government, project level payments to government data. But in order for that data to make sense, you need contracts. So to make sure that the payments, companies and countries are reporting on the payments that we're receiving, but without the contract piece, we don't know that they're actually making, that those payments are in line with the contract. So we need all of these transparency pieces in order to work together. And I think what's exciting about all these contracts coming out is it's going to make some of the data that we're already getting more valuable because we're able to use it more. So I'm looking forward to seeing what people are able to do with that data, especially when For example, aided by funding and expertise from groups like the World Bank, who are funding some of this project analysis, or these analysis projects, I should say. So, Sophie, why don't I turn it over to you? What do you see in the future?
Sure. I think it's more of a aspiration and hope than necessary vision in our crystal ball. But I'd say that we really hope that contract transparency will be the global norm. We're seeing more and more governments kind of develop policies for contract disclosure, encouraging that. More companies, our colleagues really progressing on that transparency journey, recognizing that it's not all done overnight and that these things do take quite a while. But also when we're thinking about, just as we were just saying, who's using this data, we do kind of have an answer to some of that, and that's that investors are using this data. Investors are increasingly putting ESG at the top of the agenda, and existing investors are using shareholding to influence companies' performance and what we kind of call as shareholder activism. And that's really going to continue and encourage to drive companies' performance, accountability, and then hopefully leadership in this space. But I also think as we kind of zoom out a little bit from just contract transparency, we're going to see the disclosure of other social and economic related documents. And in fact, speaking from an ICMM perspective, just last week, we announced that we're working on an initial pilot partner of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures to help progress the work on nature-positive investments. And so I think we want to continue to kind of drive the force, to continue to be a leadership position, but ironically, hopefully the future of contract disclosure is that it isn't a leadership position at all. It's just the norm.
Great. Thanks, Sophie, and appreciate ICMM leading on this until we don't need you to lead anymore. So turning over to you, Walid, I think you can give us an interesting perspective, either from the Lebanese level, or if you want to use your crystal ball to project out further how this is going to have impacts throughout the world. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the future of contract transparency.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can see trends a bit on what's going on. I agree with Sophie and Rob on their interventions. And what I see ongoing is the two aspects, actually, the energy transition part and the ESG part, the environment, social governance aspect that private companies are following. And if we look at the trend in the previous, it was more environmental aspects. It was nothing previously. Then we had an environmental trend where companies had to report on their environmental aspect. Then they introduced the social part. So they started also introducing their social aspect and their impact on the environmental social aspect. In recent years, we see the governance aspect. So we have now environment, social governance, and under the governance aspect, transparency, accountability, and good performance is key. So now good companies, reputable companies, companies who are seeking to have international investments everywhere, they are keen to implement the ESG standards, which entails having transparency, accountability, which also, if we want to translate that into practices, this will be encouraging them or encouraging themselves and the partners they work with, whether they are private sector or government, to actually disclose contracts and make use of this data and publish what they are doing in terms of legal aspects and financial economic aspects. So I see that this is a trend that is moving relatively quickly with the international companies, and it has a very good implication on the actual implementation of that. On the other hand, governments are also along this track, although it can be slower, it can be at different pace in different countries, but even with many countries and governments, this is also the trend. And with the new parliaments coming on board, with younger politicians coming on board, they are keen also to move the transparency agenda forward. And then you have two players keen on doing that. It doesn't mean that this is easy and that it can be done smoothly, but I think the trend is positive towards that. The third player, which is very important, where this forum actually is a main player in that, is civil society and the public at large. Because again, as my colleagues mentioned on the panel, if we disclose contracts and no one is reading them, or no one is analyzing them or making use of this data, then also the impact wouldn't be high. So here, there is a big role for the public in general. Are they really interested in the extractive industry and in oil and gas and what is going on there? Or is it just to make a hype out of it? And the NGOs and civil society organizations, they have a role to lobby for that and to build the capacities at the local levels for people to understand these contracts. Those contracts are very complicated. It's not that we read the contract and it's straightforward. They have formulas, they have legal terms, articles, so it's not easy. So maybe one task is basically to simplify these contracts. And what we have in mind is to make it in the future like an animation or something very simple that explains these contracts and the data coming out of that, and later on for the reporting on the production, cost, profits, all of that, to make it a very simple. Even if the contract is published, you need to make it readable and understandable. So a lot of work needs to be done at all those three levels, at the public level, government level, and the private sector. But I think we are on the right track and the trend of doing that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Walid. Yeah, that's, contracts are extremely complicated, and it's one of these things that it's challenging with a lot of this data that's coming out to make it useful and relevant to the citizens to understand how it affects their everyday lives. And I think, some of that is work that global NGOs and local NGOs are doing on contract analysis and really breaking down the numbers and giving people the know-how of how to look at these sort of things. But I think part of it also is these disclosures at a subnational level, where people are engaged. As we get more granular with the disclosures that we're getting, people are able to look at their specific communities on a project level and seeing, how that project is supposed to benefit their community, where money is being spent or not being spent, and having a say in the development of their community and then in turn in their country. So I think that that's quite interesting. Thank you so much to the three of you for all of your thoughtful comments today. I'm sorry that we were not able to get Abu Bakrin on from Mali, but I think we've still managed to have quite an interesting discussion so far. I think what I've really enjoyed about this discussion is we've had both a high-level overview of things that are happening in terms of international norms and standards, and then diving down deeper into the case of Lebanon to understand what's happening at a country level and to hear how some of these companies are operating in Lebanon and what sort of industry trends are alongside international org and country trends. So we have a ton of questions from the audience, so I just want to jump right into those. I'm going to, moderator's choice, I'm going to start with a question from Elisa Peter, since we have a question from the head of PWYP. I think she goes to the top of the line. So Elisa wants to know, she says, extractive contracts, production sharing agreements, licenses, etc., are complex legal agreements. How can we better support oversight actors, parliaments, civil society, communities, journalists, etc., to analyze the terms of these deals when they are in the public domain, so they can effectively use that information to hold companies and governments to account? So getting right at the question we just ended the panel on. So why don't we just go in the same order? And, if you don't have anything, if every panelist doesn't have an answer to this, that's fine. But why don't I start with you, Rob? I imagine since you mentioned this grant that you have coming up, you have some ideas on this very topic.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that one side of this is just making sure that the stakeholders groups that Elisa pointed to, parliament, civil society, communities, journalists, etc., making sure that they're aware of the fact that, in maybe maybe contracts in the country are available and public, and making sure that people are aware of what the terms are in those contracts. Because I think with that basic knowledge, then all of a sudden, for many organizations, they'll see, oh, there's a huge, there are contract terms with huge consequences over issues we care about, and so that can spark the inquisitive sort of beginnings, the trigger that can start this sort of analysis process. So that's one side. And the other side is we also have to acknowledge that contracts are complex legal documents. They fit within a broader legal framework. So you need to get some help a lot of the time to do sort of thorough analyses. And there are organizations and various sort of implement measures out there that can support. The EITI can support, NRGI can support, Publish What You Pay, sort of working to establish measures for them to be able to support. So yeah, go and ask for help if you need it. And so that's what I would say on that question.
Thanks, Rob. I'm actually going to interrupt answering this question and see if I can bring Abu Bakrin in. Good morning, good afternoon from Mali, Abu Bakrin. So sorry you're having so much trouble with your internet, but we're glad to have you with us. While I have you on the line, let me just introduce you real quick. Abu Bakrin is the National Coordinator of the African Initiative for Integrative Development in Mali, as well as the Secretary of Publish What You Pay Mali. So my question to you is, can you talk about the role that civil society has played in contributing to contract disclosure in Mali? Where is contract disclosure at in Mali, and what have been your main challenges? And then what role did the Publish What You Pay coalition play?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to connect to you. Allow me to speak in French again to allow you to better understand what is being said. I don't know if you hear me well.
No sé si me escucha.
Oui, yes, we can hear you. Great. So thank you to be able to speak on this initiative. The case of Mali on contract transparency, I could say that everything started from from the access of information. But we have really noted that the information regarding the mining companies, the extractive industry in Mali, has become an information that is absolutely not accessible. It's almost taboo. We have tried at our levels through the coalition, Publish What You Pay, and all the organizations that are part of it, to hold strong advocacy towards the different civil society and government in order to achieve this contract transparency. This started with a agreement of a concentration of all the effort from the civil society that allowed Mali today to publish a certain number of signed contracts, but we have noted that all the contracts that Mali has signed as of today, we have listed over 800 mining contracts, and most of these are prospection contracts. And this prospection contracts, you will see that we have 30 exploitation contracts. And this strategy, we have chosen to really allow the publication of these contracts. We have referred ourselves to the 2.4 strategy of the industry for the transparent for extractive industries that forces to publish these mining contracts with all its consequences. And that is where we have from now on tried to call upon the mining steering committee, of which we are a member through a certain number of civil society organizations that are part of this committee, we have, on the same occasion, tried to set up a contract divulgation plan. This divulgation plan, we have implemented it, and we told ourselves, as a civil society, it is important that we try to play here the role of citizen watchdog. We have set up a strategy that needs to be monitored and followed up by the people who are actively involved. This is how we were able to achieve the system so that we could really push the publication of the transparency of these mining contracts. We continue to push, and we tried always through the same strategy to make an advocacy, and this advocacy we led it by using everything that are human relations, the relations that we have with the permanent EITI secretariat, and also the relations that we have within the mining ministries and within the National Geological Research and Mining Department. It has allowed us to boost, to get the authorities to push this divulgation of this transparency of these mining contracts. And also through the coordination of the Malian Publish What You Pay coalition, and the coordinator, that has allowed us to achieve a lot of things, because despite the fact that we do not participate in a permanent manner in the EITI assembly, we have tried to play the citizen watchdog role by trying to always push these permanent secretariat of EITI, by pushing them to get the information from them, and they're trying to put all these contracts at the make it available to the General Secretary, to allow all the population can have access to these contracts, can try to analyze them and scan them after having received them, so that to create the impact we want to have today. And you will see that this situation today has allowed us to create that we've really pushed in front of the authorities, and they've understood. They thought that we were troublemakers, but they've understood that it was in their interest, in the interest of the population and the mining society. Everything that is conflict in link with the mining sector, or what we look transparency. We continued to reinforce further this strategy, and like in June, where we are as of today, we have not even reached the 1st of January, which was the initial date for the publication, but already today in June, we already have 60 contracts that have been published by the permanent secretariat of the EITI. And as a challenge, we have we're trying to. The first challenge we are facing will be the publication of the closing contract of the mine of Sisase. It was already being shut down, and the Malian state committed to taking over this mine, to take the responsibility of this mine, but the state, they took up this responsibility knowing very well that the community at the basis, that these are workers there have been, that rights have not been respected. This is really what worries us as civil society. This is really what we are fighting against. We are trying to implement all the strategies, everything that, all the ideas and plans, so that we can really push the authorities to really voting a law. Today, as of today, there is no act that was voted within the closure of this mine. And of course the Yatina mine. And the information that we have received as of today is for the closure of the Yatina mine. We have a budget of $38 billion at the availability of the government. This is information we have received. And our second challenge, which we're facing at the moment, it's mainly the challenge of the publication of the lithium mine in Bougouni. As you know, from Mali, lithium, it's a new mineral, it's a new gold. This means this transition that we have heard about, this would be a new transition a new trend which we want to profit on, and the rarity and the importance of lithium nowadays in the development of the concept of electric mobility and batteries and all that. This material is absolutely fundamental, important. But as of today, we have no information regarding this line, who's going to manage it, but we're going to continue to push for strategies to ensure that we can see everything that is behind all these contracts. And you will note that we are, together with our authorities, with the permanent secretariat of the EITI, we are actually ensuring that the entire contract the entirety of the contract, including the previous contracts to 2021, so the previous contract of the previous years, we are pushing for its publication of the entire version of these contracts, all the versions of these contracts, that will allow us to understand a certain number of conflicts that are linked to this. And I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to highlight that we've also led a certain number of campaign daily, very big advocacy campaign, and we have used them, as you've already knew, to pushing the word towards digitization, and we can see today that the information we can provide every day, the impact that these social networks can bring, even for advocacy, it's even better than face-to-face advocacy in certain cases. Today, thanks to this advocacy that we are leading through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, from wherever we are, we try to push the upper echelon so that we can win. And we have this faith in the fact that we will overcome, we will win. And we are aware that if we put our efforts together, then all the struggles which we're leading with the publication of the contracts, with the management of the conflicts, with a better governance within our extractive industry, to allow truly our communities, our local communities, to develop and to have a positive impact on our communities, on the stability, the land issue, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a thorough update, Abu Bakr. And I love hearing that you're out there being the best kind of troublemaker and really pushing. It sounds like you've made tremendous progress in getting these 60 contracts disclosed and are really pushing to get more contracts disclosed. And I think one of the most interesting things to me that you said that really triggered a lot of my thinking about, going forward with the energy transition, and also looking back on this idea of retroactive contract disclosure, and why it's important to get these contracts published and not just say, like, let's get them all, published moving forward and that'll be fine, is this issue of reclamation and who is responsible in these contracts for restoring oil, gas, and mining sites to the way that they're supposed to be and how the land is supposed to be. And, I'm from the US, and in the US, we have abandoned mine sites all over the place because these contracts haven't been disclosed, and there wasn't, potentially historically, that responsibility wasn't built into these contracts. So I think that's one of these things as we move forward, especially with the energy transition and the lithium mining that you're talking about in your country, is really having ironclad agreements in these contracts that say who is responsible at the end, because I think 50 years ago when some of these contracts were being written, they were thinking that, there's this feeling that this would go on forever and that these extraction sites would never really be closed. And they didn't put a lot of thought into what happens when this project is done or this asset is stranded. How do we restore this land for the people who need to live on it and grow food on it and raise their families on it? So I think that that's one of the things that contract disclosure can really have a positive impact is getting governments and countries to really think through what happens at the end of the life cycle of these extraction sites. So thanks for putting those ideas in our head this today. I would say, I keep saying this morning, but today. So we have so many questions here. I'm going to just start asking some questions to our panelists. The first is coming from Billy, who's his question is to Rob at NRGI, and he's wondering if you can update us on the situation, particularly if you could give us a little bit of an overview of contract disclosure across sub-Saharan Africa, and if there are any trends coming through in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of contract disclosure.
So the main trend I would say in sub-Saharan Africa is that we see sub-Saharan Africa has among the highest rates of countries that have laws in place requiring contract transparency. We also see that sub-Saharan Africa is also the place where it's most likely for countries not to be following those laws. So I think that's a really, really important thing. And from the perspective of a publish what you pay activist, go and have a look at what your country's laws are, and if they do say that they require contract transparency, hold them to account. Make sure that they are fulfilling those obligations.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to jump around for the questions here in order. So if you hear someone else's question being asked before yours, it's just because I don't want to ask all the questions to Rob. There are a lot of questions here for Rob, but I'm going to jump over to a question for Sophie. When we think of contract transparency, are we thinking only of the main extraction contract, or do we extend to subcontractors, commodity trading, et cetera? What's the ICMM stance on that?
This is one that we're really taking. I'm afraid I have a little bit of feedback.
Okay, mute yourself, Sophie. I'll jump around again. So here's another question, and I haven't read this one yet, so you'll all read it for the first time with me, and then we can figure out who to ask it for. The EITI standard is great, but what about the delay? What about the delay in its application by many countries? What about the role of companies in implementing and encouraging this disclosure process? There are pre-signed contracts, but they will last for the next 15 to 20 years, and thus they must be covered by the EITI standard. And then this question, there's the author, Adnan Aya is the author of this question. He says, Iraq did not announce its contracts, but it announced 5 amendments to contracts that it has not announced so far. So rigor in the implementation of the standard is necessary, especially at the verification stage. I think this is really interesting because, you know, with EITI and ICMM, we have contract disclosure from 2021 onward of the contract or any amendments. And so that question, my interpretation of that is that when a contract is amended, that contract should be published in full, not just the bit of text amending it. But it sounds like, according to Adnan here, Iraq is interpreting this as like, we're not going to publish the original contract. We're just going to publish these amendments that come out of it. So I'm interested to hear perhaps Sophie and Rob, your takes on and if Sophie, if your audio is working, we can jump to you. And if not, we'll jump to Rob, what your take on this question from Iraq is.
Should we try my audio?
Hey.
Yes, great. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that definitely went to the members. It was definitely discussed in depth. And on the issue of amendments, we are publishing any annexes, the full text, any alterations to the documents will be published. But of course, as you mentioned, the historic contract in and of itself will not be published due to the barriers that we discussed previously. So that's where we kind of see that stance. And then on the first question before our tech mishap on the question is literally just escaped my mind. I'm so sorry. Subcontracting. Yes. Thank you, Rob. That is also, of course, a very popular issue that's also being discussed with the EITI. And we see that really specifically with tax disclosure and whether members need to disclose taxes on subcontractors, on joint ventures. And that's very much an active conversation. I think one of the things I mentioned before is that we really see transparency as a journey. Some of our members have scored very well on that, on the EITI supporting companies assessments. Others still need to learn from some of the members on best practices. So the way that we really see that is an active conversation. It's very much in progress. And I think the first commitment, which was really at this date only disclosed about 6 months ago, is this commitment on those contracts. Doesn't mean that the journey is ended, but it doesn't mean we're so far ahead that we can already leap to the next goal.
Thanks, Sophie. Rob, do you interpret it the same way?
Yeah, so on the EITI rule, it's a very interesting point. So the EITI itself issued a clarification in 2021, I think last September, and they made it very clear that an amendment triggered the disclosure of the full contract that the amendment relates to. And that was actually a position that was supported by many companies. And the reason for that is that if you just publish an amendment on its own, you focus in on just one clause in the contract. And that, by only looking at one clause, that increases the chances of misunderstanding, because a clause needs to be understood in the context of all of the other clauses in a contract. And so, I don't know, a royalty rate on its own is, might be 2% or 10%, but we don't know what that means for the total government take unless we can see the corporate income tax, unless we can see other sort of, maybe profits related taxes, etc. on top of that. So it's really important, we think, to always, when there's an amendment, publish the whole contract, just to avoid misunderstanding. I do also have something to weigh in on the subcontracting point as well. I think it's a really interesting issue that I think Rahul brought up. I mean, subcontractors are they're in a different bracket to the main rights holder, because they don't have a contract with the state. They have a contract with another private party, the person who runs the contract. And the other thing is that subcontracts, there are hundreds and hundreds for any particular project. And I think that our where we're leaning on this, we did a bit of research called beneath the surface, something I wrote. I'm just trying to think of the title.
That's the title of your report, Rob.
Yeah. We did a report called Beneath the Surface that looked into this in quite a bit of detail. You know, our takeaway from that was that at the moment, subcontractor transparency it's a sort of very overlooked area of Extractive's transparency, and we need to start with basic things at the moment. We need to start with, you know, just being able to name the subcontractors. We need to start with, you know, getting a sense of how much money is spent on subcontractors, those kinds of things. And maybe once we have that sort of basic information, we can start thinking of these other things. But you know, I think that's the starting point, and the asking for the contracts themselves is probably a bit too far at this moment. I know that Walid and the folks at the Lebanese Petroleum Administration have thought very deeply about these questions, and maybe he has something to contribute on this matter.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, really interesting. And so, Walid, I'll invite you to respond to that, but I also have another question here specifically for you that I'll add on that you can include in your response. So someone is wondering, is there pre-contract transparency, tender documents, bid documents, if it goes through that process? And also, is there a requirement for background checks or integrity due diligence checks on the extractor directors or owners, et cetera? So maybe you could speak to both of those things as you answer your question.
Yeah, actually they are related in a way. Thanks, Rob. Basically, for the prerequisites, what we did in Lebanon, it's not a must that every country does, but for the licensing rounds, we have open licensing rounds, competitive licensing rounds, and there's a phase of pre-qualification, and there are very clear criteria for companies that have the pre-qualifications requirements to be able to participate in the licensing round. And those are published. The tender protocol for the licensing round is fully published well ahead of time. And it includes all the criteria, the legal, quality, health, safety, environment, financial, and technical criteria required for the companies. And then part of that is the beneficial ownership also. And there's this threshold that was like who owns more than 5% of the company needs to be disclosed. So basically, at the pre-qualification phase, all these criteria are checked, and the companies need to abide by them to be able to participate in a licensing round. And then part of the disclosure is that the list of pre-qualified companies is also disclosed and published. And if someone is not qualified, it is also mentioned that that company is not qualified and why they failed to qualify. This is part of the pre-qualification, and this is, I think, what the question asked for. This is at the level of the licensing with the right holders. At the level of the subcontracting, again here, based on the regulations, the operator need to do either a public call or an open tender, depending on the size of the contract. So it has to be also, there should be terms of reference or a tender with very clear qualifications and requirements for the companies to apply. And here we left it for the procurement procedures of the operators of those companies to, they do their own procurement process. But for major contracts, it has to be a public tender, and companies will be invited to apply, and then there will be clear criteria for that. For small contracts, it can be done within the procurement procedures of the operator, whether they have already pre-qualified list of companies who provide certain services, but this is limited to smaller contracts, not to major contracts. This is what is related to the pre-qualification. What is related to the disclosure of subcontracts, I think, as I agree with Rob, it has to be staged with different phases, because what we did first is at least to know who are those subcontractors, to have a list of these subcontractors, to have the beneficial owners of these subcontractors. And I think if you have a system, there is a will from the government and from the companies, it's easy to do that, even if it's a large number of companies, because the operator definitely has a database, and they have contracts, and they have Excel sheets, and they have everything. All the data is there. So what would be good is to have a national repository or a database. It can be web-based or a digital one that can actually collect all these data. If you have the system in place and the will is there from the companies and the government, I think this can be done. So the first step is to have a long list of those subcontractors, what they do, what is the company, and most importantly, who are the beneficial owners. The second step, where we have also a draft decree that is not published yet or approved, where the subcontracts are published. And here, what we mean is that not the full contract will be published, but the main components of that contract, what does it entail, what is the scope of work, and so on. Because here also there's some sensitive information, not because it has anything wrong, but again, here you have the commercial competitiveness of the companies, because if you publish really all the details of the subcontracts, you are killing in a way the competitiveness. And we have a production sharing agreement where the companies are actually investing, and then there's a cost petroleum, and then the profit petroleum is split between the state and the companies. So the more the higher the cost, the less the profit is for the companies. So the competitiveness should be really preserved. And to preserve this competitiveness, there are two elements, the commercial part and the technical part. So subcontractors need to really compete. If you publish really everything, then there's no competition anymore, because if you do the first tender, and you have 5 companies applying, then they know the conditions and the details of the winner. Then for the second round, they can actually do the same or do less or do more or collide and do something different. So there's a line where we need to really discuss in details and agree where this line stops, where transparency doesn't help anymore. And thanks, I think.
That's a really interesting answer. Thank you so much, Walid, for giving us all that detail. I want to pop over and ask Abu Bakr a question. I'm hoping, this question is coming specifically about Cameroon, but I'm hoping, Abu Bakr, you might be able to draw from some of your experience in Mali to chat about this. So the person says contracts in Cameroon are negotiated without the involvement of communities and in an opaque manner. The public is simply informed that a contract has been signed. They're wondering, how can we increase transparency in the contract negotiation process, and what are the experiences of other countries on this point? So I think this is really interesting. It's great to have contract disclosure and retroactive contract disclosure, but how are companies and the government getting the free, prior, and informed consent of the people who live in these areas and want to have a say ahead of time into these countries? I mean, do you have any insight into that?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that question, Alia. Before we start answering the question, I'm going to remind you, as I said earlier in my intervention, the media, we work a lot with media. At each meeting that we're holding, a minimum of 5 or television channels, which are the most watched, and the radios, and which are the most listened to, that are present at our meeting. This is how we work with the media. For us, these are really those that are the one at the divulgation of the information. But we haven't got the results of all these researchers. All our friends that are in the field, we have a great number of these research contracts, these prospection contracts, that are beyond the prospection phase, but they have not yet hit pay dirt. They have not given the information that they finished the prospection phase. And we note that people, they have prospection permits, but during a specific period, you will see that they've already finished the prospection. Now they're going to the exploitation phase. But these will be really illegal situation, informal situation that have not been settled. As of today, we have already called upon the highest authority through advocacy so that they keep a closer eye on these companies who are doing these illegal actions, who are in the region of Bourgogne. We have already received information that really shows that there's some mining companies that already started exploiting the mine, even though they haven't got the permits for, and where they only declared they were only doing prospecting. They were still in the prospecting stage. So these are really situations that are existing and that we need to denounce. So this is what we have been working on, and this is really the question that was raised for the moment. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response. I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be drawn from your case, and especially as Mali and both Mali and Cameroon continue to push for involvement of citizens in the contracting process earlier and more transparently in the process, so you're not getting these retroactive disclosures and then taking up issue with it. So the next question, I'm gonna probably turn to Rob to answer this, but if anyone else wants to jump in with thoughts, I very much welcome them. So this person says, Azerbaijan left the EITI in 2017, and the commitments it made when it joined the initiative have expired. In order to achieve a change in Azerbaijan's behavior in the area of disclosure of contracts and so on, the EITI coalition of Azerbaijan constantly calls on the government to return to the initiative and do what is possible. What possible advocacy initiatives can the leading international organizations in this field take in this direction? That's a really tough question. I know, like I wrote part of my graduate thesis on Azerbaijan and extractive governance there, and basically the EITI having this very difficult decision to make, whether it was useful to keep Azerbaijan in and continue to have some influence over disclosure there, or to really draw a hard line where Azerbaijan wasn't meeting its commitments. So noting that the question is difficult, I'm going to kick it over to Rob so that Rob can grapple with the difficult question.
Right. Thank you for that. I think I'm gonna give a very short answer, and I mean I think this is essentially to say yes, Azerbaijan might not be within the EITI right now, but Azerbaijan is still subject to many of the same sort of external international agreements, and the investors in the country are subject to the same environmental, social, government pressures or governance pressures from their investors. So civil society should be sort of looking to those sorts of standards and using that to sort of help make their case. Like, it might not, they might not be able to use the EITI as the lever, but now there's the GRI, which says that companies should provide information about their contracts, the contract transparency policy, why they're not publishing, provide lists of their contracts. Use that as a lever to start this conversation about contract transparency. If you have companies that are members of the ICMM, remind them of their ICMM commitments, and that ICMM commitment is not just a commitment about having a policy to support contract transparency, it's also to actually publish the contract. So, this is where I would start that. And there's a plethora of other sort of international standards and agreements that you can draw from on that.
Thanks, Rob. I think that's a good answer. And, certainly I know like BP is one of the companies that's extremely active in Azerbaijan and is bound to all sorts of disclosure regimes because of where they're headquartered. So that data, if not coming out comprehensively and through the EITI, is becoming available in other ways. So I think there are ways for civil society in Azerbaijan to be using some of that and pushing for greater accountability. Did anyone else want to come in on that question? Okay, I'll turn to the next one. So this person says, contracts are rarely static. There's all kinds of changes that are made over time. Do any countries use contract management tools? And I think, so we've talked a bit about these retroactive disclosures and amendments and what's actually being disclosed, but does anyone have any insight into how countries are using contract management tools or how they're publishing this data so that it's more visible to people needing to use this data?
I'm happy to come in on this.
Sure.
So there are a number of different approaches that countries take here, but yes, it's a very good point. Contracts aren't static; they change over time. There are amendments added to contract, so it's really important that the way that you publish your contracts, you publish them in a way where it's clear that how the relation between the main contract document and those amendments, how that that relationship is there. Some really good examples. This can be done in a really simple way. It could be done even on a spreadsheet, and I think it's Chad do it exactly like that. They have a Google Doc that's just organized in a very clear way. They add a new line when there's an amendment with a link underneath the main contract. And another great example is the Ghana Petroleum Registry. They have sort of special project pages, and on each project page they provide a bit of contextual information about the project, but then they also add space to add like amendments and other sort of approvals relating to the contract. And the gold standard here that I really encourage people to look at too is the Rondas Mexico website, which was developed for a set of sort of private sector bidding rounds in Mexico for the petroleum sector. Really, that takes this idea and then combines it with operations data. And I guess if it's okay, I'm going to take the liberty of like moving on to answer another question that I think is related, that I saw in there. I think from Mel and from somebody else too. I can't remember who, but it was talking about also the fact that contracting is a process. It's not just the contracts are the end point of a big contracting and licensing process. And yes, you need transparency over that whole process. I know that the Lebanese petroleum industry have thought a lot about that very question. I know that most countries are grappling with this. We put together a publication called, with the Open Contracting Partnership, called Open Contracting for Oil, Gas and Mining Licensing, which sort of goes through each of the stages of that contracting process and identifies good practice examples. And I believe that we also have Mel Flanagan in the audience who helped actually with a really impressive example from New South Wales, where they built all sorts of sort of easy contract maps showing every single point at which information was published and points at which consultation was mandatory, to help sort of civil society actors and journalists and any other sort of person interested in the public process understand where decisions are made and how to influence those decisions. So
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks for getting to Mel's question, because that was the next one I was going to ask, and now I don't have to ask it. I am being reminded by our lovely colleagues at Publish What You Pay to tell you that you're going to be getting a survey following your participation in this session. We really are interested in hearing your feedback on how we did and what sort of thinking this has inspired. So please do take the time to fill out that survey if you can. I want to thank all of our panelists and participants for being here. I think we've had, I do a lot of these pandemic Zoom panels, and I think this one has been much livelier than most. And part of that is because we've had some great questions coming in from the audience, because contract transparency is such an exciting topic. We've heard where it's been historically and all of the exciting things that are happening in contract transparency going forward, both with the EITI and the commitments that ICMM have made. But it is a fraught topic because we only have such a small portion of contracts that have been disclosed so far. And we really have civil society, like we hear from Abu Bakrin, pushing to get more of these contracts disclosed, and then other entities like in Lebanon, as Walid has told us about the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, really leading on taking some of these lessons learned from elsewhere in the world and getting a firm transparency regime in place at the onset of extraction. So I think that this is going to make for great changes in the sector going forward. We talked a bit about the issue of reclamation and what we can hear, or what we can see in contracts and push for and ask for in contracts as civil society going forward in the contracting process. Once this extraction is over, what is going to happen with these lands, and especially going forward in the energy transition? Are assets going to be stranded? How, what are the assumptions that companies and countries are making in entering into some of these agreements, and how are they compensating people for getting to extract things on their land? And how will those revenues be transferred subnationally, so that people are able to have a say in the development of their communities in their countries? There's just so much to think of when we think of contract transparency. And I know you all signed up for what might have appeared at the beginning to be a dry topic, but I hope that throughout the course of the past hour and a half, you've come to realize that contract transparency is one of the most exciting topics that there is. And we're so glad that you've participated in our panel today. So unless there's anything further our panelists would like to chime in and say, I think that brings us to the end of our session.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, and for all people who participated in our session.
Likewise, thank you.
Great.
I couldn't say it better. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And the next thing up is speed networking. So if you want to join, I think your system probably just prompted you. You can join the next session and get to know some of your fellow participants. Thanks so much for joining today, everyone, and for the great conversation to our panelists.
Merci. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Ok, au revoir. Merci beaucoup.